Hello, Brain Damage Philosopher here, and in this video I want to discuss a point that I've made tangentially in a number of other videos, but I think deserves a separate video to detail now that I'm coming near the end of the list of common active apologetics that religious people make. Before I jump into this video, I want to sort of talk about the general structure of where I'll be going from here. So there are generally a list of active apologetics that religious people use, which I've pretty much exhausted. At least I've exhausted the ones that are actually worth responding to in their major categories. Then there are a few implicit assumptions that act as apologetics in practice that predispose religious people to not accepting atheism. And I'll be covering those in the next few videos, including this one. And then after that, I'll sort of slowly make the transition into describing how my philosophy and epistemology my philosophy of ethics and my epistemology apply to being a skeptic and an atheist, and looking at things like conspiracy theories and religions in the real world. I'll be talking about how to apply things like Bayesian reasoning and the null hypothesis, stuff like that. Okay, so in this video I want to tackle the assumption that religious people often make that God would be a valid explanation if there were evidence for God, or the idea that since God is a valid explanation for something, or could be, then that itself is evidence for God as the explanation. Often this assumption is most evident in arguments such as a fine-tuning argument or any other teleological argument, where the fact that, probabilistically speaking, a God could explain what we see currently with 100% expectation is used to imply that that is good evidence for acknowledging the existence of a God. And unfortunately for religious people, that just isn't how this sort of thing works. First of all, obviously, they're not taking into account priors, which is something that I pointed out in my teleological video. Essentially, if all you have on the side of your explanation, besides the fact that it explains with a high expectation some phenomena we currently see, is the fact that it's logically conceivable, then that's not as strong as an explanation which predicts what we see with somewhat less certainty, but which has on its side the fact that it's actually using mechanisms that are known and demonstrable, and is not positing any new type of metaphysical commitment. So that's the first problem with using a God as an explanation for anything. The second problem with using a God as an explanation for something is that, unfortunately, a God can't be an explanation. You see, it's very easy to post hoc construct a hypothesis which fits the single instance or repetition of an event that we have available to us. And so it's extremely easy to construct a hypothesis that predicts a past event with 100% certainty, because we already know what that event is, and so you can just finagle your way into fitting whatever hypothesis you want onto an event that happened. And so this is why this is, again, this means that a God as a hypothesis is not a particularly good hypothesis, because we don't have multiple universes to inspect. Can't access or don't know of the existence of a multiverse. So we have a sample size of one. So it's really easy to look at the universe that's already developed and work backwards from there to construct a hypothesis that just happens to include a God that predicts the outcome that we see with 100% certainty. And this is what, in fact, we see religious people doing. You see, before we know what the universe looked like, for instance, in the Iron Age, when many of the religious scriptures began, including the Bible, the religious people began with the hypothesis of a God and tried to work out what the universe would look like. And what they came up with is a universe in which humans are are vastly different than all other animals, in which the Earth is the only actual planet and there's no space outside of it, and where nothing, like, things don't really work by material means, but work directly from the will of the God, and in general, just a very, very different picture from the universe that we actually see. And as we learned more about the universe, and the predictions of the original God hypothesis were slowly falsified, religious people worked backwards, adapting their God hypothesis to fit the data that they did not predict. And so now, in the current stage of history that we're in, it's unsurprising that the God hypothesis predicts with 100% expectation the universe we see, because religious people have worked backwards from what we see to their version of the God hypothesis. And it's also valid to point out that you can see the fact that they did this in not only the fact that their scriptures made different predictions before the knowledge was available, but also in the fact that the reasoning for why a universe created by a God would look like this, why most of it would only be habitable to black holes, why the entropy at the beginning of the universe would be so much lower than it needed to be, why God would wait, some couple billion years before even beginning the creation of the life that he created the universe in order to commune with. All of these explanations are often very clearly rationalizations and products of post hoc reasoning, which further demonstrates how religions came to this 100% expectation of what we see from their God hypothesis. What this means is that when you're trying to use Bayesian, or inductive reasoning in general to choose between different sets of hypotheses, you want to choose based on predictions they make directly from their definitions, based on the evidence that they had before, or based without and predictions that they made before the evidence that they were predicting is made available. Because it's very easy in general to construct an explanation after the facts are available that fits all of the facts. It's not always possible. For instance, flat earthers are incapable of coming up with a single model that explains the seasons, the day-night cycle, and so on. They have multiple different models to individually answer each of those questions, but they can't. It's not possible for them to put all of the models together into something that's not self-contradictory. But in most cases, it's possible to construct an arbitrary explanation that fits all of the facts. This is why we pay attention to priors, why we use Occam's razor, and so on and so forth. The other problem with so basically, like, using God as an explanation because you can construct a post hoc version of the God hypothesis that predicts what we see with 100% accuracy is like attributing all outcomes from like taking a hand of cards from a deck to an intelligent agent. Because if you posit an intelligent agent with the goal of making that hand of cards the outcome, then it predicts with 100% certainty that they would, stack the deck and that outcome, that hand of cards would come up. Whereas if you think that the card deck was just shuffled, then it's a 1 in some very large number chance that you'd get the hand that you would. And so if we were to use theistic reasoning and ignore the difference between priors, like whether there's evidence that someone stacked the deck, and the difference between the hypothesis in terms of one is post hoc and one isn't, then we would always have to think that every outcome of dice and cards and stuff is rigged by some intelligent agent with the only goal of making that outcome happen. Because, of course, that post hoc hypothesis predicts with 100% certainty the outcome that we would see, in a game of cards or whatever. Obviously, that's not valid reasoning. No one goes around imagining, evil, invisible card gremlins that determine, the outcome of the cards. But somehow, when you apply this reasoning to the universe itself, this becomes valid? I don't think so. The other reason that God can't serve as an explanation is that an explanation is when we take a phenomena that we don't understand and break it down into components that we do understand, and then explain how the relations of those components and interactions, which we do understand because we understand those components, result in the thing that we previously did not understand. This is why, for instance, when we talk about lightning, the explanation for lightning is in terms of clouds and atmosphere and electrical electrons and stuff like that, because those are all things we do understand. And so we've only explained lightning when we've explained it in terms of something we do understand. Unfortunately, a God is something that most religious people actually admit is inherently incomprehensible. And I think they're right. The idea of a timeless, spaceless, disembodied mind is fundamentally incomprehensible, almost to the point of being self-contradictory. And so, if we're using God to explain something, what we're really doing is taking a mystery and explaining it in terms of another far greater mystery. And that's not really explanation. It's just that we've been culturally trained to find God an acceptable stop word, where, once we arrive at the word God, we feel that it's acceptable to stop our inquiry. And furthermore, because of our hyperactive agency detector and evolutionary cognitive biases and so on, we as humans find it generally acceptable to attribute something to an intelligent agent and be willing to stop looking for an explanation once that's been found. And so, that's the only reason that people think God is an explanation, but he or it or she or whatever, it really can't be. So you've really got three problems with using God as an explanation. First of all, the priors for a God existing are so low that a naturalistic explanation, even one that only predicts what we see with a smaller level of confidence than the God hypothesis, is should have a higher confidence in our minds as Bayesian reasoners than the God hypothesis. And then two, the God hypothesis is actually constructed post hoc, which pretty much invalidates it from having its certainty in our list of beliefs as Bayesians adjusted upwards by it making predictions for data that it was actually generated from. Because that's not really a prediction now, is it? And then the third problem, obviously, is that God can't function as an explanation because God is inherently incomprehensible. So explaining anything in terms of God is merely appealing to a bigger and more incomprehensible mystery in order to explain a smaller and more comprehensible one. Furthermore, I would like to add, as a minor addendum to this, that the point of this is not only to explain why fine-tuning arguments don't work and stuff, but also to explain why why appealing to a God just isn't, in general, a very good strategy if you're actually trying to reason correctly. Basically, why you can't use the fact... Okay, so let me put it this way. I'm attempting to explain why you can't use the fact that something is more likely given the God hypothesis as evidence for the truth of the God hypothesis. You can't, because Yeah, you can't even inductively get to a God because through this method, at least, because of these problems. So yeah, I hope you guys enjoyed the video. Bye.